think a lot of times when people think about music and the arts, they will, like what need is that fulfilling? Like what material need? Does it put a roof over your head? Does it, does it feed you? At the same time, when have humans not? So I think it might be something that we even take for granted. But I do think it is important to our, fundamentally our well-being, but it's also how we communicate and express and pass down through generations our experiences.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. And if you're watching on screen, thank you for joining us as well. I'm Ronee Penoi. I use the She series, and I'm Laguna Pueblo and Cherokee. And I'm the Director of Artistic Programming and Interim Executive Director here at the Office of the Arts and also at Arts Emerson. I'm also a light-skinned Native woman with freckles, a brown leather jacket that I'm very excited about, and jeans and an enthusiastic smile. And it is a joy to see you all here tonight for tonight's conversation, Nourishing Change, Arts, Culture, and Community in the Fight for Food and Housing Justice. So we're gathered here tonight because food and housing are fundamental human rights. Feels really good to say that right now. And we also know too many in our city and across the country are struggling to meet those most basic needs. So the pandemic laid bare a lot of inequalities that have been with us for generations, but it also reminded us of something very powerful at that time, which is that when systems fail, communities always find ways to care for one another. So from whether it's mutual aid kitchens or neighbors pooling resources, artists creating spaces of joy and survival, singing out your window, whatever it is. All of this was a real reminder that resilience is both collective and creative. And the arts really has a role in there. So, we're going to be talking about food, but we're also going to be talking about the history and culture of survival strategies, because nothing is kind of limited on its own, right? Everything is interconnected. So, if we think about the rent parties of the Harlem Renaissance, when people open their doors, pass the hat to cover the bills, there's also, all of that created music, culture, and community that, we continue to hear about, that continue to inspire us. So these are not just stories of survival. They are stories of abundance, creativity, and joy as acts of resistance. So I'm delighted to say and feel responsible in saying that this program was conceived and developed with significant guidance and partnership from Berkeley's Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice. And I'm honored to be joined by three extraordinary panelists who are in their day-to-day work carrying this forward in profound ways. So first, immediately to my right, we have Asia Burrell-Wood, who is an ethnomusicologist and educator whose research centers the power of Black music and performance to sustain communities. We have Gabriela Cartagena, who is a writer, organizer, and cultural strategist deeply engaged in mutual aid and housing justice here in Boston. Going out of order, keeping it spicy. And Tran Vu, who is a multimedia artist and organizer whose work uplifts immigrant communities, memory, and resilience through art. So talk about a rock star panel. And together, they're going to help us explore how creativity and cultural expression nourish change, not only by helping us survive, but by pointing us and, I would say, modeling more just and joyful futures. So thank you all so much for being part of this gathering tonight. And with that, let's dive into the conversation. So I'm going to first start with a reminder to our dear panelists. Before you first speak, please identify yourself by your name and provide a visual description of yourself. Okay, great. So to get us started, the title of this conversation is Nourishing Change. What does that phrase mean to you in the context of your work? Would anyone like to start us off? I can also pick on you, but if you're feeling inspired, please go for it.
I'll go. My name is Asia Burrell-Wood. My pronouns are she, her. I am a dark-skinned Black woman with curly hair and currently have on the black and cream textured dress that I like very much. Uh, Nourishing change. So as you said, I'm an ethnomusicologist. I deal primarily in African diasporic music. Mostly, I do focus on this side of the Atlantic mostly, but absolutely Black music in general and culture. And I am also specifically in jazz as the managing director for the Berkeley Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice, which was also founded by Terry Lynn Carrington back in 2018, who was our founder and artistic director. I think that in terms of nourishing change and absolutely what we do in the Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice, I mean, we're seeking to advocate for, educate, mentor, and support the education and rising careers of those seeking careers in jazz and music in general, with racial justice and gender justice as our guiding principles. Being firmly in the arts my entire life. I was early music kid, of course, and also in community. I think that the arts do nourish, first, I think, most the human soul, right? Our humanity. I think it is, what we know about the arts. If we know anything about the arts, it's something that humans do. And I would posit that, and I would argue that humans do that because it is so important to what our survival, our humanity. I think a lot of times when people think about music and the arts, they will, like, what need is that fulfilling? Like, what material need does it put a roof over your head? Does it feed you? At the same time, when have humans not? So I think it might be something that we even take for granted. But I do think it is important to our, fundamentally our well-being, but it's also how we communicate and express and pass down through generations our experiences, right? It's how we also pass down our culture. So also when you are trying to enact change, which artists over the world and over generations have been at the forefront of, including this very country. I think, and they're doing that from the standpoint of the power of the music and the arts to affect change and lasting change as well. So I think about the arts in terms of, nourishing, our humanity. And within that is also exists the power to enact change for the better of our humanity and society. So I think that's how I would go about
No, it's
considering
incredible,
that.
and I love the way in which the nourishment, you're really painting the picture that art is not, it's going to the art is not the luxury, it is the thing that is feeding us into being able to continue in this other.
Right. Or we wouldn't do it.
Yeah. Exactly, precisely. Nourishing change. Would anyone else like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I can go next. Hi everyone, I'm Tran, she, her. I'm a light-skinned Southeast Asian woman, long dark brown hair and gray kind of plaid shirt and pants. Thank you for having me. I think the phrase is just so beautifully worded, like nourishing change. I was just even thinking about like a little bit like analyzing like the word nourishment, like fulfilling. We're in this context of, I know some of the topics around food, housing. What does it mean to be fulfilled, to be nourished, like during the process, and especially during the times that we're living in right now, which is so unpredictable, unprecedented in all the ways. And then the word change itself, like it's a shift, it's transition, it's a different state from one to another. And so yeah, my panelists talked about, yeah, positive uplifting change, but then there's also negative change.
Yes.
Change brings us backwards too. So what does it mean to nourishing change, especially in these times, thinking about sustainability? In my practice as an artist and organizer, utilizing arts and culture that have been with us for thousands of years is how our humanity comes about. And then in the context of modern world society under capitalism that we're living in, and thinking about, you know, inequities, different classes, intergenerational, different, what does it mean for it to, you know, connect with people, to meet people, wherever kind of space you're in. So this is the kind of thing I often think about in my own practice in advocacy, in really fighting, struggling for something to happen that hasn't yet, or has been shifted in so many ways. Is just wild to think about where we're landing today. So this idea of nourishing change, what does it mean to continue kind of in the movement, in the struggle, but yet feel like we're able to continue to feel that we're fulfilled as we're going about some of these very difficulties that are so unpredictable, and oftentimes just bring about so much, you know, pain and grief, and just really general, you know, unknown. And I think this is the path that so many of us are landing today, and so many, especially if you're trying to do something different and shift things, be change makers. So it's definitely a term that's so beautifully, I think, frame. I often haven't, to be honest, come across it, but it's definitely landed with me. And how do we continue to maintain this as we go about our work and practice?
No, thank you, Tran. And I love the way in which you're weaving in sustainability and care, and the journey of continuing on this work over time, and how that, you know, the power of that word goes beyond food, and the way of thinking about sustainability goes beyond food. It's broader, and that care is so important. I'll move us to our second question. I'll start with you, Gabby. Why do you think food and housing justice are so often intertwined? And how can the arts help us understand that relationship better?
Yeah, hey everyone, my name is Gabriella. You could go call me Gabby. I am a short Latina, Central American, very tan, short brown hair, wearing a brown leather jacket, blue jeans, and I think it's cheetah print Adidas. But housing justice and food justice, food and housing justice, you know, we, to live a good life, we need a home. We need to be sheltered. In that home, we need to eat. We need to nourish ourselves. So housing and food, just in and itself, they are basic human needs that unfortunately we need to fight every day to have. We need to work and or overwork ourselves to be able to pay rent, to be able to have enough money after rent to pay for those groceries. We need a dignified housing situation to be able to enjoy the comfort of cooking in a kitchen. Sometimes we forget just the simplicity of having a working stove is, we think of it as a human right, but here, so many people that I've worked with struggle and don't have access to. Just as a little background, my full-time work is at a housing justice organization called City Life Vida Urbana that helps people resist evictions, rent increases, and such. And it's almost like every other week that we have a family that comes in that's saying that, oh, we are renting this room, but we need to pay extra to be able to use the kitchen. And or we do not have a working kitchen. So even though I go to these mutual aid lines, I get this raw food and I don't know how to prepare the food because I don't have a kitchen. So I just think the notion and just the human survival needs of having housing and food being so completely intertwined is, it's something that us as someone with privilege who has a comfortable home, who has a working kitchen, you know, it's not something I necessarily think about or overthink unless you finally meet someone who struggles to have both and or just one. And I would say that between housing and food, even just looking here in Boston, right, the neighborhoods that are being gentrified, have had certain historical policies that redlined them, right, are now being speculated on. And those same neighborhoods are just happen to be the same neighborhoods that are also food deserts. They maybe only have one supermarket, and or they only have those bodega corner stores with like limited like pieces of food, right? So I would just pull back and say that in this case, right, we need housing, good quality housing and good quality food for just our basic means of survival. But and to live fully and to be able to live fully in community. So that's what I would say about the relationship between housing and
I
food.
really appreciate that. I think in the ways that different movements have been siloed, you can kind of lose track of the fact that, of course, to have like a full experience as a human being, you can't just pick one between housing and food. They they kind of go together. But a lot of the policies and what we hear about tend to kind of break them out. And so I think that the ways in which the connection that you talk about in your work between housing and food justice is really I just really appreciate that framing. I'm curious, Tran or Asia, if you could talk a little bit about how the arts, can help kind of bridge that relationship between food and housing justice.
I mean, there's so many, even, inspired by Kristina Wong, like even in her, practice and work, using humor as a way to invite conversation, to bring in dialogue, I think is one clear example of bridging. In my work as a visual artist and organizer, really the arts has so many different. I feel like I'm talking to the choir here, and what it means to utilize the art again to build connections, to build relationship with if you're the one who's the artist themselves or the viewer, the consumer, the really supporter, and especially in community settings. When we gather together with families, community, friends, is oftentimes food is what brings us together. That in itself is the connector. And in thinking about, and especially these days, addressing issues around housing and is, again, so unprecedented in so many communities, and not only in the US, but around the world too. What does it mean for us to truly have shelter and spaces of belonging, knowing that we're truly invited in. And so I can list so many examples of just amazing like art projects and just creative like art endeavors that really seek to question, to invite, to spark conversation and dialogue, and also change policy as well, especially for decision makers, leaders, to really see the reality, especially when you're not at the front line, you're not at the center of those being most impacted by these very issues.
No, appreciate that. Yeah, did you want to add to that?
Oh, I would just say that we also should consider that the population, any population that is being impacted by housing insecurity and food insecurity is going to also include artists. And especially in the United States, different countries have different policies as it impacts the arts and artists. But here in this country, it can be, while a very rewarding path and career, many of those that have those creative careers are going to face, maybe at some point, not always, but at least at some point in their career, they might be facing housing and food insecurity while they are pursuing their profession in the arts. And there's a way that I think we just accept that and in the United States, where we don't have to, we have this belief of struggling artist, and it's just but why? Why must artists struggle? Why must anybody struggle? And also, when we're talking about class, and for example, being impacted by classic working class, that is going to include artists. So I think it also, because of that, artists have always been, I would think, involved in speaking to and from lived experiences. Um, addressing those inequities and injustices as well. And as you said, have had creative responses to that question, that amplify, that draw attention to. And I think that has been first really important because of an artist's ability to do that, because of the gifts and talents and skill sets that they have to express the human condition, right? And the human experiences. And of course, I know we'll get into eventually rent parties and certain, yes, and creative responses to that have actually, worked and sustained, and also many things have come out of that. But to your point too, community, and that is something that artists are also really good at. Many of them are, not everybody, but about building communities of belonging, and wherever they are. So that also, you have artists or artistic presence in communities, in cities and towns. It if they're able to sustain, it usually goes to benefit that entire place, that entire neighborhood, or town or community. So it becomes better for everybody.
Right on. And that takes us beautifully segueing into the next topic, which is to say that so historically, events like rent parties were about moments of survival, but also about culture, which is just what you're speaking to. So what can we learn from those models today, or are there examples of current activities that are taking up the mantle? Do you want to get us started? And then
I'm happy to
give you a lot.
Listen, don't threaten me with a good time. I mean, when we first started this conversation, we were talking about mutual aid, and I think the question had come up is, like, has there been, those examples in, at least from what I would know about, in Black music history and jazz history, and like absolutely all over the place. But one of my favorites are rent parties that happened in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. Right. Yeah. And this is what we're looking at, especially like kind of coming into like the 20s and on, and you'll have African Americans migrating up to the north, from the South, escaping the violence of the Jim Crow South. Now, by the way, not escaping racism entirely, because it's everywhere. It's in the United States. We're still in segregation, okay, mind you. And also, but also many of those being artists, creatives, writers, jazz musicians, visual artists, dancers, all of that. And also many also having domestic work while they are, again, pursuing their artistic endeavors. Now, at that time, I think the way that they were developing New York, they started to extend the subway line up to what we now know as the Harlem neighborhood, and famously, as Duke Ellington composed, A Train, literally. And he talks about, Duke Ellington has absolutely talked about that, many of his song titles, right, are directly about life in Harlem. Right. So if you listen to, anything of Duke Ellington's, that's going to be present there. They overbuilt houses, or housing, initially meant for the wealthier class in New York City, and then couldn't really, there was actually too much inventory, and some forgetting who the developer real estate person was, but eventually had the idea to, open it to these new Black migrants. But of course, they're also having to like keep up with that rent, and of course they were doing crazy things too. Like, I think one year they had like doubled the rent, right? Just we know this, right? This is things like that is still happening. What do you mean? Like, who has an extra whatever laying around if you've determined that this is how much you can afford? But they would just like do that. And so one of those creative responses were rent parties, which also are an extent, it's just a carryover of Black culture, something that already existed in Black Southern life, which is juke joints. Have any you guys have heard of? Okay, juke joints. But now we're in this, urban, and northern environment. We're talking apartment buildings and not, houses and more agricultural landscapes, right? So the juke joint moves into a tenement, into an apartment. And so the elements of that were already in community, right? So it's a new, a newer form of something that already intergenerationally existed, that the community would have had knowledge and access to. So, okay, cool. I'm short on rent. I'm going to get, and make sure we're going to have food. We're going to have some booze, obviously, and and some really, really good music. And I'm just going to invite, hey, can we come over? Can you come? We're however, those invitations, were extended, and you have these incredible jazz musicians, right? And even to the point that we get the stride piano, the style of stride piano, which is kind of rooted in ragtime, but also, syncopation, rhythmic, actually develops in Harlem apartments, right? Even a style of piano playing develops, because also on the upright piano, because the upright piano is something that you are going to be more likely to have in an apartment versus a grand, who has room for that? And also means for that. But anyway, and so that's what would happen. And maybe you're paying, like, I looked it up, it'd be like maybe 25 cents sometimes around that, which I looked up would be about maybe $4 today. So you mean I can get food? I get low.
Yeah. That's a deal, ladies and gentlemen.
$4 for, I could get some, some good spirits, as some good liquor, maybe some food and good music, and we're going, for as long as they would go to the night. And actually I have a note, I think, yes. Okay. So the New York Amsterdam News had reported out, like, during this time, that there would be, mind you, we're also in prohibition a little bit, during some times too. So about 500 speakeasies, the speakeasies, these apartment speakeasies in Harlem existed at that time, that would be putting on these parties weekly. Almost any apartment building that you could think of had at least two of these things going on weekly, at any given time. So it's absolutely, it's part of the culture. So to your point of, when systems fail and when there's injustice, and like, what are these creative and cultural responses? Okay, rent parties, right? And that's kind of how that happened. There's more there, but that gives you a little bit of an overview.
Oh, that's incredible. No, and thank you for sharing your expertise there, because I just so love it is the intersection of so many different facets, and it's also art moves change, and this change and this movement changes the art. It's just this interdependent, series of
It's a cultural
relationships.
process.
Yeah.
It's happening all the time. Yeah.
That was beautiful. Yeah, Tran, would you like to go next in offering some reflections about these rent parties and, survival and culture?
Yeah, definitely. It's what I would call, under the umbrella of, like, artivism, like intervention, essentially. Endeavors and projects that's aimed at really building movement and bringing people together. I was looking into, like, definitely more about, like, the context. I appreciate the history of it. Into crypto parties too. This is something when I was involved, especially in, like, the digital kind of, like, and thinking about, like, security, personal security, and now especially with modern technology, where people get together and share best practices and tips on securing ourselves online. And with especially, like, things that this is now, it's become more like even two-step authentication, especially for folks who are not tech savvy. So I was actually working on some of this aspect, and like, how do we bring people together, especially like various ages, and like really, because say example in technology, it's not just one thing that you protect yourself. You have to protect people around you, because you're going to be affected. If you're safe yourself, and like say your family members or someone that you're in contact with, you're going to be vulnerable if they're not protected too.
Exactly.
So it ties into that, like, we're all tied and accountable to each other. Another example, and I've been like, so I love these like models of like resiliency, especially bringing people together. One that I really love is called Sunday Soup. It started in Chicago like years ago, where artists, creatives, people doing projects come together for meals, and they'll chip in money. Someone would, host it, get the food home cooked meal, and then they'll put it into like a jar, reimburse the person that hosted like ingredients, and then afterward there's a small fund, and so people go around and pitch projects. And then the money goes to fund that project. It's a small amount, but it means so much for like, someone trying to get something off the ground. I often think of that as almost like the pre-Shark Tank days, now we're thinking about like, the threads of money. But I another, again, example, and it happens in so many cultures, generations now, the idea of community loans, people bringing their money together. And like, I know that in different community culture, there's literally terms for that, where people, neighbors, families pitching in money so that someone can start a local business. Like literally when banks are, like have, all these restrictions, you have to have a certain status, but what does it mean to really fund ourselves and our ideas? And so these are the models that I always love, like, and it's been around. So that's the thing, it's nothing new. It's just different forms of it, and bringing people together in a ways that's accessible, inclusive, and that we're responsive for one another's well-being, because we're so tied up in it.
No, I so appreciate that, Tran. And what I love about what you're naming is that, I feel like something I hear a lot in the past year has been so much of what's happening is unprecedented. Like this word is used a lot. And for me, it truly is. No, there's precedent. There's precedent everywhere with everything that is happening. And there have been resilience and strategies for the communities have had since time immemorial about how to support each other through kind of the many apocalypses, so to speak, over the course of time. I know that's very true in Native communities especially. So it's, I think sometimes being in 2025, I think folks can often think, oh, there's a social safety net, there's programs, there's this, but there's always been and will continue to be a need for the way in which we need to take care of each other. I mean, so much of the need is about moving from like and so much of the thread that we've been talking about, even though it hasn't been like named in the title of this gathering, is people coming together. People coming together across these different areas, and when that happens, change comes out of it. So yeah, Gabby, can I send it over to you?
Yeah. When thinking about rent parties, I think like at the root of it is like cooperativism, like just how revolutionary cooperativism is when you work with people around you, when you save up with people around you, when you pitch in things. It reminds me of two moments. One is this like myth from the village my family's from, about this farmer who overharvests squash, and he decides to just hand out the squash around Halloween. And like the Halloween in that village, which is literally around Halloween, it's called El Día de Casiano, which is like the day of the squash. And when I finally heard, I guess like the legend, I was like, wow, that's cooperativism. Like that is the legend of what people now label as like socialism, right? Like if I have an abundance, like let me share it. Or if there's an abundance of a thing, let me share it. And hearing you, Tron, you know, when thinking about like the pockets in Spanish, or at least for Salvadorans, we call it el bolsillo, right? Where everyone chips in 100 or whatever it is they can afford. And there's like a rotating schedule of who gets given that extra money for you to decide what you want to do with it. And also thinking about how my family members came to this country, which was decades ago, but also even 2 decades ago, it was very hard. And the immigration system in the United States historically has made it almost impossible to try to make it into this country legally, right? And there are cooperative means of like trying to pay someone to bring you into the country, because legally entering through the border means you will get detained by God knows how long, right? You're literally put into prison. For some people, it could be months. Some people, it could be years. Some people I've known have been there for decades just for trying to legally enter the country. So it just really has me reflect on how my family has been able to not only like come into this country and now become citizens through this like cooperative model of like gathering money together, but also the cooperative model of like, let's make sure we live together when we start up in this country. Let's share the rent, let's share the food. Let's do these bolsillos. There's a group right now in the North Shore area where they're doing that same concept, but to try to eventually buy a house, right, in a cooperative way. So I just love the way in which cooperativism and mutual aid just intertwine, and how creative like our communities and neighbors and cultures can get with, okay, we have a little abundance. How do we make that into something bigger? How do we nourish each other to finance that dream, to finance that thing we imagined and now have an opportunity to make a reality, which I think is like also the beauty of art. Like, you know, we are given, you know, not everyone tends to like see themselves as an artist, but in like I guess like the indigenous practices I've learned through my communities has been like, all right, actually everyone is an artist. And like, we tend to forget that, hey, your mom making this delicious meal out of scraps in the fridge, like that is an art.
Yes, it is.
You know? So just like reclaiming like, what does it mean to be creative and artistic with the basic amenities that you have in front of you, and or like what we see as scraps to make something beautiful and delicious and tasty. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, that's incredible. Well, and I feel like you already gave us a little bit of this, but I want to bring to all of you this question of what are some additional examples, going beyond kind of rent parties as the frame, but broader examples of grassroots cultural organizing that you've seen are really directly impacting access to food or housing, or some of these other interconnected issues.
I mean, well, notably, although sometimes people forget about this detail, I mean, historically, the Black Panther Party absolutely was were you know, organizing you know, just breakfast for children, right? Early school morning breakfast, right? Like they were that was one of their programs, right? You know, and free meal, free lunch, you know, those type of programs. That, which is also to me crazy why we're still, you know, fighting or debating that children deserve, you know, free lunch, free breakfast, school children, and it's just, I find that to be absurd. But people often forget that that was one of the Black Panthers programs.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and of course there's more, but I did want to raise that.
Oh, 100%. And I think there's so many examples where something started within one specific community and then kind of became a broader thing, and we lost the where it came from. I mean, speaking of art, like I loved learning on the Pit TV show from Pittsburgh, and I had no idea about a particular program where Black individuals were being taught essentially how to be, kind of do emergency medical treatment, for communities where it wasn't necessarily a given that you were going to be able to get access to medical care when you had an emergency.
No.
They wouldn't go to your house. So the ways in which that training kicked off something, and then it kind of gets looped in as a thread into it. It's so interesting to me the way in which artistic practice can be so impactful in all of these things we're talking about. Yeah, other examples, Tran or Gabby?
I know, Gabby, you mentioned cooperative. Like, it made me think about just even the co-op movement, where that stemmed, and like workers' rights. And so much of that is threaded again in this idea that we all deserve, the resources and opportunity to live, fundamental kind of human lives. And so my head was thinking around just like the different co-op models, and how that is also in this different phases and everything, and also some models abroad too. But then I was also, the other thing I was thinking about was the context of like nonprofits too, and like with government entities, and how that has translated to, whose responsibility is it? And we're seeing, like, again, the state of nonprofit funding philanthropy too, where a lot of groups and organizations are struggling for funding, and especially during, again, these times. But then it's like, I feel like things have shifted to like the responsibility of government to like, nonprofit, and like almost like, outsourcing it in a sense. And then these very nonprofit grassroots and then collectives have to emerge in order to be in a way to intervene, to see the direct need that's needed in local communities. So for me, I'm always thinking about like systems, like why is it that certain things are landing the way, and when things have to be, because it in almost defensive mode, because there's no one here showing up to do it, or the responsibility hasn't trickled down, or wasn't enforced in a way. And so what does it mean to be in response of that? And do you wait until something happened, or you just go ahead and do it? Which oftentimes communities are accountable. It's like, okay, we have to make this work, even if it's not there. We have to be resourceful, which oftentimes
even though we deserve more,
and the
better,
and the creativity that takes to transform, to be resilient, both in creative as artists. I'm also someone that believe everyone is an artist. It's how you use your creativity to really think about what is needed, and the resources to reflect our times. Right on.
Yeah, I'm happy to shout out some initiatives in case like people in the
Please,
crowd want to like plug in. But I live in a neighborhood called East Boston, which is right next to the airport. And I'm not sure if everyone knows this, but at the height of the pandemic, like the middle of 2020, like June, July, when people were like, oh, what the heck is going on? Mutual aid efforts started surging throughout the world, right? In a formal way where we actually started recognizing them as mutual aid efforts, right? Because a lot of these efforts already existed in a way in which didn't necessarily have like a label to it. But in this resurgence, particularly here in Massachusetts, there were mutual aid efforts that erupted throughout the entire state, from Western Mass to Boston. And particularly, well, unfortunately, since 2020 to now, a lot of these mutual aid groups have kind of like died out in the formal sense because of kind of like what Trem said, right? A lot of these groups, they were autonomous groups led by neighbors. They didn't necessarily have a nonprofit structure or financing to support them on the long term. But one particular group in East Boston called Mutual Aid East Boston, they played the game. They were like, all right, like for us to survive, we need to formally become like a sponsored entity. Like let's do it. Let's make it happen. So they're currently, I think they finally, I'm not going to get into the finances of it, but they are an actual entity group. They're like, all right, let's start flying towards potentially becoming a nonprofit. But Mutual Aid Eastie, is a mutual aid group right now that exists, is doing the work. They have open offices every single week. Just this week, 3 families came to the offices saying, hey, our family members got detained. What do we do? Right? And mutual aid, EC is not a legal aid group, but they're like, all right, we have some neighbor must have a relationship with a legal aid group. So someone was like, I have a relationship with Greater Boston Legal Services. Let me connect the immigration unit to y'all to get these families the advice, the legal advice from a lawyer that they need. So that's just an example of a effort that is happening right now, mutual aid in East Boston, and it's very culturally relevant, led by people who are reflective of the community, and an ensemble of people directly affected to amazing allies with like abundant financial resources. So it's just really beautiful to still see that in action, and also a little bittersweet, a little bitter to not see that across the state. But I will also add that, just a plug-in for the housing justice work. City Life Vida Urbana is part of a larger statewide coalition called Homes for All Massachusetts. And collectively there, like, as of, I would say, the beginning of this year, we've been doing more like arts and cultural programming to make sure that, I'm sure y'all have heard the term or the phrase, right? We need to make the revolution irresistible. We need to make it beautiful. We need to make it juicy. So this is our effort of trying to make fighting against evictions and against rent increases, and now fighting for rent control, to put rent control on the ballot for 2026, something that is cool and that people want to be a part of, because, right, the imagery should look great. We got music coming in that is like literally rent control. There's a rent control song by a rapper called Twice Thou, who's from Dorchester. It's an amazing song. It's on Bandcamp. But just, it's just so important to include these like cultural, artistic juices and flavors into the organizing work we're doing, to, one, make it attractive, two, make it relatable, and just a simple platform of allowing someone to share their story is like at the center and core of, I think, all organizing, right? Like once someone who is finally facing a crisis gets to share their story and gets to hear the same like crisis being faced by so many other people, and seeing it artistically reflected in some sort of like collective poem, or like a writing workshop together, or just listening to a song and reflecting, or even just like we watched Wicked like a few months ago, and just the essence of sharing your story and seeing it out there, and understanding that I am not the only one facing it. Like this is not an individual issue. Like I am not the problem. This is part of a larger systemic crisis that is not an anomaly. Like thousands of other people are also facing this. Like I am not alone. So just like the power of just sharing your story, I think, is like really at the core of cultural organizing.
Well, I'm so glad that you landed us there, because I'm going to move us to, I think I have time to maybe take one question. But what I want to say on that is that I think part of what I love so much, and what really resonated with me about Food Bank Influencer, is the focus on shame and the kind of stigma around having food insecurity, housing insecurity, being in this position. And for us to make change, it needs to be visible, and it is so tempting, and so heartbreakingly, often, that anyone, from a university student to to anyone in the city, any of Boston, could be food insecure at any given time.
Can I just, actually, speaking to the shame, and I'm so glad that that's coming up. I have actually a quote that I found really amazing from Duke Ellington himself.
Oh,
and
hey.
I thought when I
Love
was
it.
looking over this, this is absolutely also, like, where, in my community, in my family, they say, like, tell the truth and shame the devil, because because the
Yes.
shame is not on you, the shame is on the system,
Yes.
right? So Duke Ellington, in his own words, said, owing the rent is more a case for rejoicing than for despair, and is as much an excuse for a party as as it is a means for raising money. It really is a source of income as pleasant as it is novel, right? And so I, again, going back to that joy as the act of resistance, that also is like, listen, we are all in this, like, we're in the community. So there's no because if you've ever experienced that, ever feeling like, I'm not sure if I can even make the rent, like, that's stressful. At the very least, it's stressful, but also it can be, you can feel shame or a stigma, because why, you maybe, like, you feel personal failure, so you might not even be sharing that even within your own community. And so it seems to me that also rent parties and the way that they were also just like takes all of that right off the plate. We know what's going on as a community. We know what's going on. Whatever, don't worry about that. What time is the party?
Yeah,
kind of
exactly.
It's kind of what I get from that. So I just wanted to share that.
100%. It's changing the story, to something else. Would anyone like to ask a question?
So, question for the panelists. If you could give us one action tonight, whether it's in our communities, in our civic engagement work, or in a creative practice, to change the system and to intervene in housing and food insecurity, what would that one action be?
I could kick us off. So
You're ready.
we are in ballot season, meaning that this is the 2-month period where if you want to put something in a ballot, you need to collect 75,000 plus signatures across the state. And right now, City Life Youth Urbana with, Homes for All Massachusetts, under their campaign, Keep Massachusetts Home, we're trying to collect 75K signatures across the state to put rent control on the ballot. So if you are a resident of Massachusetts and want to support with collecting signatures, please connect with me. I could give you the information for you to get trained to collect those signatures in your hometown or here in Boston, or if you have like enthusiastic neighbor friends from Western Mass or Central Mass, let us know, because we need the whole state to put in their contribution. Let's try to put rent control on the ballot, y'all, because one of the biggest things that keeps people from getting the food they need is refusing to buy food because they want to pay rent and or pay the rising rent.
Whew, love it. Yes. Other suggestions?
Amplifying all the stuff that you shared, Gabby. I think the one action word that comes to mind is show up. Like, there's just, in all the ways, there's so much happening at the ground level, at the grassroots level. I know in Dorchester, the Dorchester Food Co-op is also in danger of closing too. So, yes, the daily table closed. So be able to show up for ourselves, for our communities, do, actions. But I think that's part of it. It's like, not being avoidant. There's so much cruel reality, but how do we show up for one another?
Echoing what both of you just said, and I would add, this might sound crazy, but in terms of the creative practice part, literally go to see live music, go support the artists in your own community. They're here, and look up where people are pay those ticket prices gladly. If they are selling CDs or merch at the table, buy that too, right? And yes, we love all the big stadium. I go to those shows as well. And that is live music, and we should support that as well. But there are artists in your community that would absolutely are also at the intersection of that live and experience at the intersection of this systemic crisis as well. So, and you probably can think of some already. I can kind of see in your things popping up, but literally go support local artists, live music. You put money, you are putting money directly in their pockets. Do that. That's absolutely going to be impacting. And then lastly, I just say, I think, let us not ever forget to lose the art of community building. We can be very individualistic in American society, but I come from a culture that community and kinship is a value, and it is definitely a part. It is my value as well, and I think we're slowly losing the recipes, if you will, on how to maintain and connect, just literally connect with each other and build community.
Wow. Okay. I will say nothing else because thank you so much to these rock stars. What a fantastic question. Thank you so much. And with that, I'll wrap us out.